What's up, humans, and welcome to a new Psicoactivo. Okay, so yesterday I was supposed to interview my next two guests, but the Harald Malmgren interview dropped, and it completely changed everything we were going to do because a lot of the information that was released there is new information that pertains to the case that these two people have been following and investigating for a while now. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Craig Oliver and Mr. Michael Armentor. How you guys doing?
Yeah, how's it going?
Welcome to Psicoactivo, guys. So I wanted to ask you guys because there is this account called the Magenta 1933 Project or something similar to that effect. That is you guys, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is the Magenta Project, and what did you think about last night's video of Mom?
Well, last night was pretty nuts for us in particular because we've spent over a year going down the rabbit hole, putting together the story behind Magenta and kind of everything after it. And so to see somebody besides David Grush.
Just about, yeah.
90 years.
1933 was the first recovery in Europe, in Magenta, Italy. They recovered a partially intact vehicle.
It's long been known that the regime of dictator Benito Mussolini documented numerous UAP during this time. This internal memo from the Italian secret services includes crude drawings of the UAPs.
It's true. It's real.
Yeah, that actually happened. Italian government moved it to a secure air base in Italy for the rest of kind of the fascist regime until 1944, 1945, and the Pope Pius XII back-channeled that.
So
Especially of Harold's caliber, openly talking about a lot of the stuff that we found. It was just kind of like, all right, this is happening. It's really big. It's like it took us forever, and it was thanks to breadcrumbs, by Danny Sheehan, folks like that, Ross Coulthard. It was kind of all of this stuff over time. It's kind of like it made sense, why everything has been teased out the way it has been, because it is kind of this giant story. The whole thing is just like one massive puzzle and way too much for any one or two people to put together. And it's not about what are UFOs and who's flying them. I mean, that's its own part of the story, but there's this human element that goes way beyond the cover up.
Yeah. And Michael, how did you guys meet though? How did you and Craig meet?
So we initially met over Reddit, where I had been kind of posting some of the conclusion series to my research about the 1933 case. And then we just kind of started chatting back and forth at first in a private chat with a couple other individuals in the community. And over that time, we would kind of put leads together, kind of talk in the middle of the night about UFO stuff and kind of just in general, got to know each other real well through there. And eventually we started reaching out to each other personally and having long conversations about the case. And everything just kind of formed organically, kind of looking back on it, because there wasn't like a set moment where, we started talking and we were like, okay, we're going to do this. It really just started with us just kind of talking almost every night, trying to figure stuff out and like just going over documents and just trying to understand the intrigue, which is probably the most time-consuming element when you're considering these things, is to kind of consider the intrigue of all the different important characters involved and what information might mean, depending on how you interpret it or what supported by different facts and stuff. So Craig really helped me with a lot of that stuff, like in a period where I had already been doing some serious research, but I didn't have anybody in my network to really like talk to all the time. Craig was probably the first person that I got to where I was like, I felt like he was a solid connection that I felt like I could talk to somebody like more at length about all this. So
Yeah, it's really cool meeting people like that over research in common, And essentially, just to be clear to the audience, what we're talking about today is what could be considered the first documented crash retrieval in history, UFO crash retrieval in history, which is not Roswell 1947. It happened 14 years before that. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Magenta. So in the city of Magenta, which is just outside of Milan in Italy, in the year of 1933, I believe June 13th.
And where would you guys start to walk the audience through your investigation?
So I like to usually start this with how I started, because it really all started with me with the Grush testimony. You know, it's if you look at kind of the structure of his interview, 1933 was really one of the first things that he brought up. And so it was kind of obvious to me, you know, I had already kind of had a little bit of context of who David Grush was and how important the moment was when he was in his interview. You know, I didn't know a lot of the details at the time, but I knew enough to know that it was important testimony. And what struck me about the 1933 year, and I couldn't get this out of my head for weeks afterwards, was the name Allen Dulles. I knew already all about Allen Dulles, and I kind of knew a lot already about the history of the CIA and, you know, a lot of Wall Street banker stuff and other stuff about the financial system that you pick up if you're learning, especially about economics, you know, because if you look anywhere into how the economics of this country got to be the way that they are, these dudes are kind of all over it. So, you know, I was already kind of coming from that knowledge base. So the possible connection intrigued me. And so I went searching, and I found a wellspring of information of connections between not only Allen Dulles in Italy at the time frame that this case was allegedly scooped by the Americans, but also I saw him in a position over several people who had the motive and the means to be able to hide a crashed and recovered UFO. And that was kind of what the first couple parts of my series on Reddit was actually about, just establishing the fact that it was plausible and historically possible that the OSS received back-channeled information from the Vatican in instance. And, you know, and a great example of that is that Bill Donovan met with the Pope in July of 1944. And so, you know,
this is Pius 23, or is that it?
This is Pope Pius the 12th, correct? Yeah.
12th. Yeah, the 12th. Okay.
Yeah. So, and, you know, and so that right there, you have the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the Wartime Intelligence Agency, meeting with the Pope at a time where Rome had just been liberated. And that's essentially the time frame that David Grush alleged that, you know, the craft was scooped by the Americans. So I established that it was possible. And I knew before the Malmgren interview that, you know, kind of like it was possible. And that's kind of where everything changed, was with the Malmgren interview, is that, you know, we didn't really have a whole lot of extra corroborating testimony. The intrigue of, you know, Roberto Pinotti and all those kinds of people is sometimes can be kind of thick and hard to discern for people who aren't willing to go read through a bunch of stuff in a different language. So yeah, the Malmgren stuff definitely kind of moves stuff forward pretty significantly.
Craig, I wanted to ask you about, because, you know, when you talk about potentially the first crash retrieval in history that happened in Italy, which is a fascist nation at the time, there are a lot of different theories about what UFOs might be. So back in 2004, 2005, something like that, I remember seeing a documentary about someone who was trying to sell an aircraft at one of those shows where there's like auctions and stuff. And this person presented something that seemed disc shaped like, and it was really big, and it had the Air Force logo printed on it. I don't know if that story is necessarily true 100% because there were only illustrations of it. But that was a documentary that I don't know if it was the History Channel they released. So that took me through a very big rabbit hole about potentially the Germans and the Italians managing reverse engineering UFOs. And there are even people who think that it's possible that Roswell was actually just a man-made UFO made by the Germans. What is your take on that? And then I'll get Michael's take too, because I know it may not be real, but that's been around. And now that you guys are investigating this, it's okay to ask you, though.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard that story. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising, and something that I think a lot of us have been learning is, what the Germans were working on and the Italians, during the war and post-war, and the very specific saucer-like designs. We know the U.S. was kind of doing the same thing. I think Canada had the Avro car. They never really got anywhere, but it's part of what we discovered, and people sending us files and old magazine articles and things like that, is that the Italian Air Force right away in like 34, their aircraft designs immediately accelerated. Yeah. And they were very like flying saucer like, basically. They were trying very out of the box things, that were way more simplistic than what anyone understood about, general flight and aviation and aircraft. These were like wingless little things, so it's kind of like there's no way they would have thought any of that could have worked if they didn't have access to something that did work, and they hadn't been seeing it a lot, and so part of this story, the Magenta story, is that Mussolini caught wind of it. I think it was discovered by a couple of farmers, somehow reported up, and Mussolini had his, basically his fascist police go and confiscate it. And he put out a telegram, a few of them, ordering strict silence, upon threat of death, execution, basically. And so they brought it in. The famous Enrico Fermi, who, has won the Nobel Prize, he basically was tasked with putting together a research team. And that was led by Guglielmo Marconi, who'd also won a Nobel. And they thought, the Germans, the Italians, the Germans were basically asked to come check it out because the Italians thought it might be theirs. And they did, and they were like, it's not ours. And Mussolini was like, cool, is it the US? It's somebody else? And Marconi was like, no, this is ET. And so, so he led that team. And, we don't know a lot about what exactly happened for the first few years. We kind of know where it was stored. In 37, construction was started on Mount Sorate in Italy, which at the time was the largest bunker in Europe. And so if you think about it in context, why would anybody be doing that before the war? Why would you be building this like massive research facility 2 years before World War II? And so more and more and more, one thing we've come to understand is that it's a very distinct possibility, and maybe even probability, that World War II happened because the Germans and the Italians had this stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking as you were talking.
And they were fascists. They wanted to take over the world, and then these Americans from the OSS get it with the help of the Vatican, and there's a lot to that story as well. But, in the general sense, it's almost like the wrong people got it, basically. And, other things happened around that time. A lot of the stuff, our friend Geoff Cruickshank, sort of figured out alongside us, about the crash in Cape Girardeau in 1941. I think there were 2 crafts recovered after the Battle of Los Angeles in 42. It's around the time that, Oak Ridge was ordered to be set up, and the Manhattan Project and the UFO Project were pretty much the same thing. And, there was the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit that was created around that time. And everyone knew about this. We have the paperwork on all of this. This was all straight up to FDR. And the shortest version of it for now is that the wrong people got their hands on advanced technology, basically, and then they created the CIA after Roswell.
That's wild. And then Operation Paperclip takes a whole other meaning based on this, which is wild.
Right.
And so, NASA and everything.
So as my segue, it's good that you bring up Operation Paperclip, because there's another very historically undervalued subject I'd like to bring up in conjunction with that. It's something called the Sunrise Negotiations, or Operation Sunrise. So that was a series of negotiations conducted by Allen Dulles from allegedly around 1943 to 1945. But some sources suggest that this kind of activity was happening earlier than 1943, where essentially he was communicating with German members of German command in different capacities and organizing an illegal and separate surrender with the German kind of like generals that were involved. Karl Wolff was one of them, and several other of the major German generals ended up being directly involved in Operation Sunrise.
Where is this information sourced from? Which documents? Or
So there's a whole series of documents about Operation Sunrise. Allen Dulles even himself wrote a book about Operation Sunrise, where he detailed these kinds of events. Because for him, that was actually what propelled his career forward. When FDR died, kind of right there in the middle of the war, and the administration changed, all of a sudden his activity got a lot more friendly. It wasn't necessarily so illegal anymore. They kind of briefed Truman, and then he decided to bomb Japan. So that's kind of like how it went in that sense. But Operation Sunrise itself is directly related to the Vatican, because a lot of the members of the Vatican were responsible for what's called the rat lines. And that's where they were basically kind of handing out diplomatic immunity to Nazi war criminals and allowing them to escape Europe into South American countries. That was, the characters involved in that were also deeply involved in Operation Sunrise. So it was essentially kind of like, at the time it was being conducted, these were essentially secret negotiations, between members of the German government in power and, Allen Dulles, to kind of protect them from the Nuremberg trials that would later come. And he did. He protected many high-ranking Nazis in several capacities, personally at great cost, throughout the Nuremberg trials. So much so that it's really required to ask it at a deeper level why he did such a thing and why he felt like it was worth it, especially when so many of the Germans were actively blackmailing him and portraying him as he was doing this for them. Because obviously Nazis were a bunch of two-faced dudes and they didn't necessarily keep their word. And but the kind of bottom line is that he wanted access to the stolen wealth that German leadership had, and above that, he wanted access to German industry and German trade secrets.
Technology,
of course, just technology in general. But broadly, so much was done to save particular members of this equation. Like Eugen Dahlmann is a perfect example. And he was just saved so many times by Allen Dulles and James Angleton personally, where they just got him out of hot water. Apparently, he just had a get out of jail free card that you just really start to think critically, and you're like, okay, what is actually going on? What kind of leverage, what kind of lasting leverage did the Germans have over Allen Dulles? And the more that kind of emerges about the allegations around Nazis doing reverse engineering, that kind of is the only thing that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
If they had access to experimentally proven technology that the Americans didn't have, and they were, not necessarily threatening to shop it off to the highest bidder, but they were making it known that they controlled this technology, then that would have been a really crazy bargaining point for somebody like Allen Dulles. He would have been very tempted by claims of secret weapons. In fact, the OSS on documented occasion, investigated claims of secret weapons by the Germans in numerous occasions. That's not a conspiracy theory. They did that. That's part of the historical record. So, it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility that, reverse engineering matters in general had an effect on stuff like the Sunrise negotiations, and then in turn the Nazi rat lines, and then in turn the Nuremberg trials. So I think that's also kind of a broader point about how a lot of this history intersects, because history around World War II is like that. There was a couple key characters who were kind of pulling the strings on millions of people. And, you run across this situation kind of time and time again, where it's essentially the same group of dudes that are responsible and have their hands in world events, and it's they come from a certain place, typically Ivy League universities like Yale and Princeton.
Secret societies.
Well, and yes, secret societies, and that's like James Angleton was a member of Skull and Bones, and the Knights of Malta, which got a prominent feature in the Malmgren interview. That's definitely more important than anybody's realizing right now. But and those are I'm sure, just two very surface level kind of examples. I'm sure that if we went just a little bit deeper, there could be even crazier examples. But I feel like it's almost not even necessary. It kind of demonstrates the point that rich people don't ignore spirituality, and they don't ignore the kind of more esoteric realms of consciousness and stuff. They use it to their advantage, and they use it to communicate with each other. And that's kind of something that is an unfortunate reality that a lot of people haven't really caught up on.
And they feel comfortable also keeping it under stigma.
Yeah,
because that's better for them to operate in the dark, because if there's stigma and it's prominent, then they don't have anything to worry about.
Well, and I think an element of this too is that they kind of see themselves as the responsible rulers. Like, I'm depriving people of information because it is the responsible and the way to protect, the people that I am interacting with. And, and that's something that I've always refused to do throughout this research, is dehumanize people. That's what fascists do. That's not what I'm in the business of.
That's real.
It's like I deal with a lot of shitty people in my research. And if I spent all this time being angry and upset at every single one, I would never get anything done, because I'd be angry at all of them. And because it's messed up, but at a certain point, you're just going to have to try to be a little bit more clinical about this kind of stuff, and kind of realize that, like, well, also another important thought exercise is, like, if you were in a point of power or a position of power like that, like, what would you do? How would you make these decisions? Would you keep UFO secrets from the public just because people might die, or people might be uncomfortable with the truth, or it goes against your religion, or it goes against your lack of religion? Like, these are questions to ask yourself when you're asking yourself, do I think that UFO stuff should still be secret? And
so let's talk about that. What would you do, and what would Craig do if you were in this position?
I'll let Craig go first up and talk.
You mean within, let's say, hypothetically at that time period?
No, hypothetically, you're one of the people that has a hold of this secret, and like Harald said on the interview, he said they consider themselves guardians, just as Michael just described. Would you keep a secret so big from the people if there was a sense that you're protecting the people, or do you think everybody deserves to know the truth no matter what?
My understanding of it is that, as Grush said himself, as it is with humanity, there's, good non-human intelligence and bad non-human intelligence, and, part of wrapping our heads around this idea of something bigger, and, other things existing in different kind of strata, and across a spectrum of, crypto terrestrial, ultra terrestrial, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, all of this stuff, that's, it's hard enough to wrap our heads around. But for one, it looks like we've probably known about a lot of this stuff in the past, and that got buried, and part of what we've been learning, the more we sort of pick at this story, is how these financial institutions came together, and how it was all the same people in charge of eventually this secrecy. There was, if you look at before 1910, and the robber barons taking over and the creation of the Federal Reserve in secret by J.P. Morgan and his buddies, you could openly read about giants and Atlantis and all this weird shit. The maps were different, the history books were different, and then everything got changed. And it's like even the basic question of Tesla, being sort of sidelined by the likes of JP Morgan, that was because they all decided we can't have free energy, our bloodlines all live like kings, and so now that we can create energy and charge for it, that's what we're going to do. Like, you know, we can't have this like fancy free energy shit, you know, that he was talking about in 1900, you know, and before, and, you know, Marconi was after as well. So it's like so much of this is all sort of the same story, you know, that, you know, to bring up Greer, you know, as we were saying before we started recording, it's like there's a lot of wild stuff he said that's proven to be true, you know, love him or hate him, whatever in between. You know, this is a lost century, you know, this is this like transnational crime syndicate. And Grush basically clearing Magenta was a way of people figuring out how really it is all kind of one story, you know, and we've joked about it some, but it took me forever to wrap my head around it, you know, after learning what I could from Michael, but, and Geoff, you know, really the only two people I know of in the world, you know, who were putting together the bigger story beyond what even, you know, Roberto Panatti and Paolo Guazzardi have, you know, where they know a lot of the Italian side of things. But this whole story is about control, you know, and I'm not a fascist. And so I would say, you know, I very much would want, my desires are the opposite of anybody like that. And so to circle back around, what would I do if it were up to me? Like, yeah, I definitely think, you know, it's like part of this story is all these advances in science that we could have had. We could have been healthier. We could have had all these things. We could have not gone to all these wars. You know, we could have not been dependent on oil. You know, like it's really, it was all these decisions were made by the same people. And that's the reality, you know, and the other side of it is that most of, you know, what we're calling now non-human intelligence, you know, the history and mythology of it, most of it's not negative, you know, especially if you go back to anything pre-war, you know, it's like there's a lot of weirdness for sure, but you know, I don't know if there's quite as much to have been afraid of as people thought, you know. And so as somebody who grew up in horror novels and comic books, all that, you know, and you kind of face all that stuff down and being afraid of the dark until I was in my 20s, you know.
Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe and all that
stuff, right? You know, eventually you kind of go, all right, you know, and just don't sort of kick the hornet's nest, you know, at the wrong time, and you'll be okay. So.
What about you, Michael?
So that's a question that I've wrangled with constantly throughout my research, because I very much started at a place where I definitely thought it was extremely immoral and illegal to continue hiding this information from everyone. And as I kind of went through the research process, I seriously doubted myself, and I doubted my assumptions, and I really challenged myself to, you know, either stick to or change that belief system. And, you know, no matter how much I possibly gain sympathy for people who are protecting information, I think that there's a reasonable expectation from the government of transparency about the nature of reality. You know, if I can't expect from my government or in the country that I live in to have a baseline of respect for me, to, when they're speaking about reality, to include all of reality, then the social contract is broken. That at a fundamental level is not, you know, you can have national security and protected information without obscuring the nature of reality. You know, you can continue to have classified military programs and do whatever the military does. It's not going to stop anything to tell people some of the basic facts of what's going on and provide them with a framework to think about the future that's not just us being alone in the universe and being solely responsible for, you know, any possible life in the future universe. That's kind of what it feels like humanity feels about itself sometimes. It's like, well, if we survive, then life and the entire universe is doomed and it'll never happen anywhere else, and it's all over, you know. And it's just, I think that that's highly unlikely. And I think that I think that part of it is that our national security officials are being extremely sensitive about a subject that they have no control over. And I feel like that's a natural tenet of exopolitics instead of geopolitics. You can you can spend money to have control over geopolitics, but is that same money that you spend trying to control exopolitics going to work for the entire galaxy when you're spending money on one planet trying to regulate all of exopolitics? It just doesn't work. So,
Nope.
and also, like, as a baseline thing as well, if people continue to see religion, spirituality, and exopolitics as three separate things, people are going to continue to disagree about entire worldviews and nature of reality that is, perpetrating some of the largest conflicts that we have on this planet today. So it's like, I don't think a lot of people realize that there's a reason why UFOs should be higher up on the priority list. And it's the reason why is because it's kind of where the materialist meets the spiritualist in the middle and says, okay, there may not be any evidence for God, but like there is some crazy anomalies, and like maybe we should figure out together what we need to do here. Like, and it's obvious that people of institutions and perhaps colleges have already done that behind government's backs, and that's maybe the program that we see today. That's a possibility. And so, to them, there's probably some kind of technocratic metric for society that when we reach it, they'll be happy to discuss it with everyone. But if we don't ever meet their metric or their expectations, obviously I don't know. But if, I'm just throwing out scenarios there, but it boils down to that if I was a person that had this kind of information, and and also, being a researcher who's had access to private discords and protected information, I've kind of had that a little bit of taste of that myself. It's like I know things that I'm not necessarily just going to spout off about, like so that's a equation that I already deal with, and I already decide that like full transparency is the way, and that you have to find a way to protect yourself and be fully transparent at the same time. Like, it's a difficult balance, but one that you have to make if you want to be genuinely expressing your emotions about something. And, in a genuine interchange of information like that, if you're not, participating in a way that if you're participating in a way that you're holding something back, that's fundamentally wrong. Like, so that's, it's been a difficult process for me to kind of arrive at that conclusion sometimes, because I sway back and forth on the argument, and I'm of course always open to new information, but I always err on the side that, like, there needs to be more information out. It needs to be less stigmatized, and people need to be more accepting of understandings that accommodate for the weird anomalies that happen. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that it can't be understood. And I think that especially applies to like psionics and all these other consciousness related fields, maybe even human initiated contact experiences. And, I think that as baseline, without data for these things, if we're ever going to find anything out, we have to have an open enough mind to be able to speak about them, talk about them in a way that, someone's not immediately laughed out of a room for just bringing it up. So,
yeah. I remember Dr. Putoff recently said, when he was being interviewed, that if anything that can help humanity or society evolve, it's been classified or stigmatized. And this includes all of this stuff that we're talking about right now: psychedelics, real ancient history. It's pretty wild. And just a couple of things. I like that you brought up this spirituality aspect of it, because there's a lot of people that tend to conflate spirituality with fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism. And I think that's a big mistake, because you can be generic in the way you approach the mere concept of spirituality, and you're okay with it. You don't necessarily have to adhere to a religious standpoint or an idea. That's another one. And the way I see this question, though, for me, it's kind of scary, because the way that I'm approaching these topic is through ESP generally, and human potential. And if everything that I've been investigating is just a little bit true, that means that the general abilities that humans have or seem to have to do with remote viewing, precognition, and all this stuff, and telepathy and all this stuff. And I keep going back to a film called The Minority Report, where that world seems kind of a little dystopic for me. And I don't know how, as many as we are today in the world, I don't know how the world would react to no longer having to hide anything, because we can read each other's minds. Essentially, we can predict the future in many ways, and that is scary to me. And if that one of those scenarios could become true by revealing the truth to the people, I don't know if I would reveal it, to be honest with you, because it's like telling another country during that Manhattan Project how the bomb worked to another country that would have detonated it before the US did, And I see it similar to that, but at the same time I also struggle because I do want for the truth to come out.
Yeah.
But it's a real philosophical dilemma.
Well, yeah, and when and it's no surprise to me that people have obviously gotten kind of caught in this same philosophical dilemma, and it's probably still all classified and stigmatized in certain places today because of this exact dynamic that we're talking about. Just because it takes time to sit there and be like, well, what if it's like this? What if it's like that? And people will always go back and forth. People will never agree. So if you're trying to get a group of even 40 to 30 people to agree that something should be let out, good luck. It's not really it's not a super easy process. So I think that it's, you have to balance, your expectations for transparency. You have to temper them with the possible realities, because they're not going to release everything. That was never going to be a thing, but if I think that some reasonable transparency measures should advocate for at least just some baseline facts. Is it real? Is it happening? Have there been crash recoveries? Yes or no. Doesn't need to be all this stuff. It's a certain part of it is that, if you can give people a part of the information that they want, it would probably go a long way in government trust. We could possibly see, I don't know how much that's going to happen with the current administration, regardless of what happens. But, it would definitely, a lot of people would see that as a step forward, And I think that, regardless of the administration, there's a lot of people, who work in the government who aren't necessarily associated with the administration, but are still working for the government, that have a lot of sway over this issue. And, it's those kinds of people that I often think about in my work as well, because I think about the people who are responsible for managing the information on this issue today. That's got to be an extremely difficult and complicated thing in the era of podcasts, where you've got all these different insiders on different podcasts saying different things, and all these different private groups that people are in and such. I'm sure it's a very complicated landscape. And so,
Oh yeah.
I think that empathy for the human side of this subject is undervalued for kind of how important it really is. It's really important to have empathy across the board, and an extra dose of empathy when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, because, otherwise it really is a very psychologically damaging kind of thing to think about all the time,
and draining. I wanted to go through some of the images that Craig is going to share for us. So I'm going to go one by one. Is that okay? And you guys can just walk me through. Man, I like this combo. It's good.
Yeah, awesome. I know it's
got philosophical and everything.
We got to the point where we realized that was part of all this. It's that's why this disclosure process in general is such kind of a delicate flower, because it really is about rethinking how we see the world.
Okay, so I'm gonna share this one right here. Yeah.
Right. So this was it's part of a bigger file, but so basically this was cleared by the Pentagon's Stopser office. I think it was declassified September 6th, 2023. So right after the hearing, and it really stuck out to me because I realized that the description here, and kind of it's missing the rest of the context, but that basically this talks about a craft recovered from Italy. And as David Grush described it, that the craft was lenticular in shape and seemed to have sort of a bell shape because of the way that it crashed. And, you know, a basic kind of old school dome in the middle. And so once I think this file started making the rounds a few months ago, it really stuck out to me because there we go. A vehicle that's acorn or bell-shaped, appears the edges broke off during impact, lenticular, saucer-shaped with a raised center. You know, see whatever is here about the OSS eventually landing on FDR's desk. There's your Magenta craft, and there's your declassified file.
Yeah, and I inevitably will ask you about the book that was written by Nick Cook. I don't know if you guys have read it,
I
but
haven't read it yet. I'm well aware of it, but yeah, I haven't gotten around to it.
he talks about the Hunt for Zero Point is the book, but he talks about this Nazi bell, Die Glocke.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a possibility that people confused this with that? Maybe they were working on that or something like that?
My understanding now, it kind of updates every couple weeks. One possibility is that the declock was from the hull of this craft, recovered UAP. Another possibility is it sounds like there was this crash in 33, another one in 36, and then another one across the border in Poland, which is very interesting, in 38. And I did see recently that supposedly there was another secret bunker with a craft, possibly Glock, found in Poland. So it might have been also like too big for them to move too far.
Whoa.
Another thing I've seen very recently is, you know, you're probably very well familiar with the Admiral Byrd Antarctica story.
Yeah, of course.
And possible Germans having contact with non-human intelligence.
Operation High Jump.
Yeah, right. So I kind of, you know, it popped back up into my radar recently, and it kind of made some things make more sense in that supposedly the Russians and then the Germans went down to investigate in 1930. So before the Magenta craft, actually. And it's thought that possibly D-Glock could have come from there, and possibly they have other recovered craft or a base down there, or just, you know, some bigger, crazier aspect to this whole narrative of the Nazis having some Antarctic base and UFOs and all this stuff. So I don't know. I saw a couple videos about it with some, you know, historical stuff. I haven't had time to like dive too deep into that one yet, but to think about that, and then to think about 33 and Mussolini and Hitler taking power, to think about what they do after getting their hands on Magenta and possibly a couple of others, you know, and the construction of, you know, the biggest bunker in Europe at the time, to do research on Magenta at the very least, and then to go to war and try and take over the world, you know, basically in 39. So it all adds up, at least. But as far as D-Glock and this thing, I think there are two distinct craft.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that's
Mike, do you want to add something?
So, yeah, I will add that it's really interesting that the German nuclear research program was not aimed towards building a bomb. They never had a wide-scale effort comparable to the Manhattan Project in Germany. And it was actually the Alsos missions that was responsible for recovering those nuclear physicists from Germany. And basically in that whole series of intrigue, they came away with the conclusion that Germany was not even close to building a bomb. So based on that, their nuclear research was obviously siloed in an area that they weren't or didn't necessarily through the public eye make it to the allies that we could see, but as far as hidden assets associated with nuclear materials, not only did they have the motive, the means, and the capability to do such a thing, but their lack of a nuclear weapons program suggests that that's exactly what they were doing. So there's only a couple different branches of research that you can take other than a large bomb. It's like propulsion, energy generation, or a big old bomb. So the other two possibilities other than a bomb that they could have been researching, in possible hidden assets that were then later acquired by the OSS, partially through the Sunrise negotiations and the Paperclip, Operation Paperclip, that's certainly, it's more than a possibility. It's probable that there was at least one or two secret German programs that just got totally absorbed by the Americans and just deleted from the record. Because it's also certainly possible that the Germans weren't keeping any records of such things in the first place whatsoever. I mean, they had extremely cruel practices for building facilities, sometimes going as far to, unfortunately, execute everyone who worked on the facility during its construction so it could remain secret. So
that's even in the movies and everything,
Well, and it's also it's a true historical fact that's what they did. And so, just think about the logistics. I mean, you take a bunch of people, force them to work, and then they're gone. How are you going to make a paper trail out of that necessarily? That's definitely within the realm of like oral testimony. And that's certainly the kind of protection that any sort of advanced German thermonuclear research or propulsion research or energy generation research, it would have taken that form of security and kind of protection. So, and then it's definitely not likely either that like the Russians got it, for instance, because a lot of the German leadership were very against communism because they owned assets and they owned parts of industries. So, I guess, when you're looking at kind of the argument from first principles, like was Die Glock real? Of course, there's no perfect evidence to suggest that it was real or anything. But there is certainly evidence to suggest that there is something that has been hidden or has not necessarily been forthcoming that was involved in this series of events that justified to people like Alan Dulles, like why he needed to go save all these Nazis. It's also abundantly clear that the U.S. government has continued to struggle with that moral choice that he made on that day for the rest of its existence now, up until today, where we can hopefully kind of break the embargo of conversation about it and kind of get it to a more healthy place. Because as it is right now, a lot of people don't even know that a person like Alan Dulles saved so many Nazis personally, or that he was even involved in such a thing. A lot of people don't even know that whole situation even really went down. They might understand some stuff about, Operation Paperclip and stuff, but they've certainly never heard of stuff like the Gelhin organization or Operation Sunrise or some of these other, what may be outside of the, typical, like literature around the intelligence community. It might be considered like fringe, but obviously to people within, the government and the intelligence community, they're fully aware of this kind of, very complicated history. So it kind of puts you, it's a very kind of different frame of mind when you know about this stuff versus when you don't. Like,
is there any way after we finish that you guys can give me the shareable links that I can give the public so they can look for themselves and check out the information?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, to go. Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next image. Is that okay with you guys?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So this one, I'm gonna use it here.
So this is a headline from Popular Mechanics. So anybody can go look this up. But I'll let Michael tell the rest of this and kind of where this starts, and especially Michael's journey before I ever hopped on board. So,
okay, this is the part of the story where we have to get into the part that I've gotten in a ton of arguments online with people about, because essentially, all of this started with a man named Roberto Pinotti in 1996. This is how the public has any information about this case whatsoever, where he received a collection of documents from an anonymous source that detailed the recovery of an object in 1933, the security parameters around that object's recovery, and then just in general, a series of telegrams that showed this kind of series of events, and also just in general UFO reporting coming out of the Italian fascist regime. He spent 4 years studying these documents and giving them to various sources to authenticate them. Like, for instance, he did a linguist where they analyzed the words used and the handwriting, which were all, proven to be, only words used that they would have used at the time. There was even several specific examples of terminologies and abbreviations that were only popular at the time being used within the documents. And then on top of that, he also had it. So it was a collection of original documents and also photocopies. So the ones that were actually original documents, he chose several of those to turn into photocopies and have the originals destroyed so that he could determine if the paper was, if the paper was from 1930s, if the ink was from the 1930s, if the radiocarbon dating, lined up to what it was saying, so he kind of took that extra step of destroying some original documents. Obviously, he didn't destroy all of them doing this, but he did do that and did a rigorous, chemical analysis on the paper and the ink, which all, of course, again showed that it was 1930s paper and ink that was used to write these documents.
Wow.
So, and but that, of course, that still doesn't confirm them to be real. Of course, it does not. And so the next question is, okay, where might these telegrams might have come from, right? Who might have released these telegrams to Pinotti? Because there's not much you can really do with an anonymous source. But that was the point that it remained at until David Grush came forward and made his claims. And it was at that point where shortly afterwards, Grush met with Pinotti and kind of, I don't want to say gave an endorsement of his research, but at least gave his research the baseline credibility that, like, hello, I am the whistleblower with access to classified information about this case, and you are the seminal researcher. I'm here. It was a validation of some of his core research principles about the 1933 case that, he had examined over the years.
I'll jump in real quick. Yeah, anyone can find this. Grush, right after the hearing, I think it was right after, he did this is just a podcast. You can go search this on YouTube. But he basically did an interview with Pinotti and Paolo Guazzardi, who's another kind of leading Italian, UFO researcher. They've both been around a long time. And so Grush basically gets interviewed about what he knows about the Magenta craft. It's pretty short. It's like 20 or 30 minutes tops. But definitely, anyone who's wanting to digest this more, I would go look that up.
Yeah, and it's a great piece of context too, because David Grush just kind of gets into the details, and he states explicitly how he knows this information, where the sources are, what the sources are. I mean, obviously he states he can't name the sources or anything like that because they're active members of the intelligence community, presumably the way that he framed his statements around the matter. But it gave enough of a connection between Grush and Pinotti to say, okay, if these two claims are related, then let's look for the commonality. Let's look for the combining thread between the Americans and this 1933 case. So shortly afterwards, what Pinotti does is he releases a new book about the 1933 case with new information involved, where he, for the first time after all these years, speculates about the identity of the anonymous source. And also simultaneously, on a 5 gigabyte CD-ROM, drops all the documents that he has from all the years that relate to all of this, all the emails, everything that he has. He's kind of an older gentleman, so something like putting 5 gigabytes of documents scanned.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
And scanned and put onto the Internet Archive was obviously something that's not easy or cheap. So he released it in a CD-ROM, which is actually kind of ingenious, because now that we're aware that it exists, somebody can just go put that up on Internet Archive and everyone will have it. But that's obviously still pending right now. But he speculated for the first time in that book that a member of the Ciano family was responsible for the document dump, and that the documents were related to a series of documents called the Ciano diaries. And now, so that was a pivotal moment in the case. And I was already following the case a little bit kind of as that happened, as that information kind of dropped. I was already kind of in the middle of my research where I had kind of discerned that there's a connection between some of the key Italian figures and some of the key American figures, particularly a man named Galeazzo Ciano and Alan Dulles. So this is honestly the craziest part of the story, because I think how I initially found this information was I put this long triad into a AI search engine called Find, P-H-I-N-D. And it was a Hail Mary shot at the AI, just looking for something on the internet. And I kind of just put in a little bit of details about David Grush, 1933, and also stuff that I knew about Alan Dulles and kind of different elements of his history. And amazingly, by some stroke of luck or, divine intervention by the AI, it gave me this 70-page document about the Ciano diaries. And it said, this isn't a perfect match to what you're talking about, but, is this what you're talking about? And so I read this document, the 70-page document that also happens to be released in 1996, by the way, the year that Roberto Pinotti got his anonymous document dump. And it specifically details the series of events that led to Alan Dulles acquiring a series of documents that were associated with the Ciano diaries from Ciano's wife, Etta Ciano. And I initially read that document and I didn't really understand how it was connected to the Magenta case. But it was later, after I was kind of studying Pinotti's book, after I was able to get a translation, that it finally kind of all clicked into place. Galeazzo Ciano is the man in the Italian government that was alleged to be directly overseeing the RS-33 group.
Oh.
So
what's the RS-33 group before?
So the RS-33 group was the group that was alleged by Pinotti's documents to be the group that was formed in Italy to study this crashed UFO. Right? Okay. So they called it RS-33. There's been a little bit of back and forth about whether or not that represented the year. He says no now, but at different times he said yes, that's what it was about, but that exact part isn't clear.
But basically special research, yeah.
Basically special research 33. And it makes sense too, because not only was Galeazzo Ciano located in Rome, but he was Mussolini's son-in-law.
Oh.
So his wife, Etta Ciano, was Mussolini's daughter. Okay? So it was widely known that Galeazzo Ciano was number 2 in the Italian fascist government. So it was kind of at that point I was like, okay, now we're cooking. All right. So now there's a reason why the Ciano diaries may be connected to the 1933 case, because not only does the timing of Pinotti's documents kind of line up with when this case started getting covered again historically, but also because the wife, Etta Ciano, died just months before Roberto Pinotti got his documents. So I, that's where my kind of loose hypothesis formed right there on the spot. I was like, okay, Galeazzo Ciano must have been a central figure in all this. Alan Dulles must have known that he was kind of the leader of the RS-33 effort that had been previously kind of going on. So that was kind of the hypothesis framework that I started working with from there. And I have to go through layers of multiple hypotheses here because essentially there isn't enough confirmed information about the 1933 case for me to really make solid conclusions on any of this information. So that's part of the difficulty of even speaking about it, is that, you know, you kind of have to get within a speculation based on if something else is true. So if it's true that Galeazzo Ciano was leading the RS-33 effort to study the Magenta crash from 1933, then in his subsequent execution in 1944, Galeazzo Ciano, that is, we can perhaps see him attempt to use the documents that ended up in Pinotti's hands as leverage to save his own skin. Perhaps that's why that collection of documents existed in the first place. Because when you look at the series of documents that Roberto Pinotti received in the first place, they had to have been from the Foreign Office for once, because they concerned foreign domestic intelligence that was bound for a foreign source, and which from 1936 onwards, Ciano was the foreign press minister of Italy. I mean, the foreign relations minister of Italy. So like a little like a step under the prime minister, dealing with a lot of international relations at the time. So essentially, Ciano would have had scope over the type of documents that these were, Air Force reports and the like. And so when I dug into that kind of 70-page document that I kind of mentioned earlier, that details the story of the Ciano diaries, that's where I finally found kind of like the American connection. Because it turns out that as, you know, Galeazzo Ciano was executed in 1944 for betraying Mussolini and his regime. That's kind of the reason why he was executed. It's because he had voted against Mussolini and the Grand Fascist Council of 1943, because obviously Mussolini was messing it up pretty bad by that point, and pretty much nobody was on his side. But after his death, his wife, Etta Ciano, escaped from kind of where they were at in Germany and took the diaries with her, along with a bunch of supporting papers and telegrams. She was specifically protecting a series of documents and telegrams from her husband's Foreign Office time that were supposedly destroyed by the Germans in a subsequent investigation when they were, you know, when Etta had already escaped and they went back and look for the documents where they found him. They supposedly found him. But it's incredible to me of that synchronicity that she happened to be carrying documents that could essentially fit the exact same description of the documents that ended up in Roberto Pinotti's hands in 1996. And then kind of come to later find out that her death was only like 1 or 2 months before he received the documents. So there was only one child of hers that was alive at the time and kind of like able to be the anonymous source. It essentially would have had to be a man named Fabrizio Ciano, who died in 2008. That's kind of the determination that I came from in combination with Pinotti's work, and then also kind of looking at the timeline of the documents associated with the Ciano diaries.
Do you guys know why Pinotti was chosen to get these documents?
Yes, actually, because the source originally reached out to major news outlets and the story was ignored, because in Italy, obviously, it was a social faux pas to kind of bring up their fascist past, which they were trying to move past from at the time. And so it didn't gain any traction. And since it had, you know, a direct prominence on UFO material, then that's kind of why he was chosen. And so that was kind of my basic understanding of the diaries for a little while. And then here's where it kind of got a little extra complicated. And this is the hardest part to explain. So throughout this series of events, we're at a place now where Ciano has protected, a series of telegrams and her husband's diaries for essentially her personal benefit. Now because Hitler has ordered the execution of her husband, she starts threatening Hitler. She starts sending angry messages essentially to Hitler saying, if you kill my husband, I'm going to go give my husband's diaries to the Allies and you're going to be screwed. And obviously Hitler did not like that. So he ensured for a fact that Galeazzo would be executed. And so Ciano did exactly what she said she was going to do. She went to the Allies, i.e. Allen Dulles. She reached out specifically to the Allies for the contact of Allen Dulles specifically and no one else. She wouldn't speak to anyone else. And she arranged in exchange for publishing rights of the documents and publishing in the American markets, to give over her husband's diaries and the supporting papers that she had access to Allen Dulles. But here's the crazy part. The supporting papers never made it to Allen Dulles. He got the Ciano diaries, and he was able to use those in the Nuremberg trials to convict certain Nazis that he wasn't saving, and to kind of also simultaneously help the Nazis that he was saving by screwing over other Nazis. But the supporting materials, such as the collections of telegrams that were associated with the Ciano diaries, were assumed by Allen Dulles to be destroyed and captured by the Germans. But the kicker is, there is one person who would have had the motive and the means to be able to hide documents that may have pertained to UFOs in the fascist era. It was Ciano, and she died in 1995, shortly before Roberto Pinotti received his anonymous dump.
Pinotti got those telegrams, presumably.
Well, presumably, now that we've connected those dots. But when you look at this history from the outside, no one had any idea that it had anything to do with RS-33 or it had to do with a crash in 1933. And in general, the authors of that 70-page document that is honestly a extremely important source of my work obviously had no idea of the true importance of this extremely interesting historical account, because they definitely treat it seriously, but it's also clear that, if they would have recognized that they were investigating hidden assets associated with UAP, they would have gone even deeper than they chose to go, which it's a pretty deep document. I can have you share a link with you so that you can share it with your audience as well. In case
Thank you. Yeah.
Kind of, also just have the PDF file, because it's just a fantastic resource for kind of understanding the series of intrigue. And kind of an incredible story that's wrapped in the middle of that is how Allen Dulles got convinced that these documents were actually gone, which is really interesting. There was a German spy named Hilde Perwin, or Frau Beetz, who actually hid a tin of papers in her rose garden that were supposedly these papers, translations of these papers. And she gave them to Allen Dulles and told him, oh, hey, these were the papers that were associated with Ciano's diaries. And Allen Dulles was like, sounds good. And case closed. But historical analysis of those documents that's also included in that kind of original same 70-page document that I referenced from 1996, they talk about how this collection of papers that Frau Beetz gave Allen Dulles was identical to another series of papers called the Libsyn papers. So it's actually not likely that those papers are actually the papers that were associated with the Ciano diaries. Because essentially the Ciano diaries had been compiled as a kind of COA, cover your ass, for Galeazzo Ciano. Are you going to include a bunch of worthless intelligence that the Germans probably already have in your COA pile? of documents, like, no, it's probably going to be something that actually merits, you having leverage in this situation with these documents, i.e. if they were UFO files. That would have been simply, genuinely the most geopolitically poignant type of documents you possibly could have had as a man like Galeazzo. And it actually makes sense if he would have compiled UFO documents and then thought that, oh, these documents are good enough to save my butt no matter what. As long as I leverage around these documents, I surely won't get executed. But, that's kind of where the understanding of it, that like you look into the people who were assisting with this kind of Galeazzo, and particularly around at the time that he fell out of grace with Mussolini. And it's really interesting that a man who was deeply involved in the Sunrise operations with Alan Dulles was actually chiefly responsible for the series of events that led to Galeazzo's execution. Eugen Dolman, again, was the initial point of contact between Etta Ciano and the German government, where he initially, when they were, after they had angered Mussolini, they were obviously looking for a way out of Italy. And Etta Ciano met with Eugen Dolman to try to arrange a way for the Germans to take the Ciano family out of Italy. But at this time, obviously, Ciano had kind of spent several years defrauding and also being against the German government. So there's even questions about how loyal Galeazzo and Etta Ciano were to each other, because it was also known that they cheated on each other, and they kind of had separate relationships, and they kind of weren't tore up about it. Like, they weren't necessarily, obviously weren't a traditional couple, which, I mean, especially it was just speaking a lot for, this is like the 30s and 40s that we're talking about. So obviously a lot more stigma around these things, but that's just kind of, that's just kind of people that these were. And I think that's about all the details there. But when you boil it all down, it's possible that the story of the Ciano diaries and their associated papers is continued by Roberto Pinotti receiving an anonymous document dump. More research is required to confirm those facts, of course, and I'm doing my best every day to try to do that. But as I'm the kind of hypothesis framework that I'm looking at right now is that.
Okay.
And I'll add to that real quick a couple of the things that that Michael found. One, Ida Ciano published her memoirs in '77, and you can find this. Is this on the Internet Archive, Michael?
Yes, it's called My Truth by
Right.
Etta Ciano.
And she can go just read it for free. But she clearly states, and I can send you, I know I have the stuff, the images from it, but she clearly states that the diaries were absolutely essential to Galeazzo Ciano trying to save himself and his family. And then after he died, they were as integral to her attempts at, escaping to safety. And then also, Alan Dulles had the diaries published immediately after the war. And there's a very clear statement, on the CIA's website about the Ciano diaries, that they were the most important documents to come out of Italy, out of World War II.
Yeah, that's actually a part of that 70-page document that I referenced right at the beginning. And an important note about that document as well is that it's a document that's hosted on the CIA website. So, that's where I initially found that PDF and was able to kind of connect all this information together. And, something that really threw all this for a loop was when I found out that it's highly probable that Galeazzo was actually an Allied spy for Alan Dulles. And the Germans may have known about his deception as early as 1941, 2 years before he actually betrayed Mussolini. So that begs the question, why did he go along with the operation to take his family out of Italy when it was the Germans who were doing it? He had been working against the Germans essentially for years at that point. So that's kind of also opened up the hypothesis to me that Galeazzo Ciano, the husband, didn't go along willingly with the thing that went along to his execution. There's an interesting fact about that as well. To the airfield that they were taken to by the Germans, he was transported separately from his family. So it's very possible that they just took him without his, obviously without his consent. And obviously that would have been a moment of crisis for Alan Dulles when that happened, because essentially, when you have a penetration that high, you're talking about the second in command of a government, and they're penetrated and working for another government. That's a dream source for an intelligence official. That's somebody who's given you intelligence about the leader every other day. And that's a source that is obviously irreplaceable. So
it's also open knowledge that Italy was basically bullied into taking part in World War II by Germany. And that, especially after the war, I mean, that's still a long-standing issue that is something they're still reckoning with. The fact that so many Italian men went to war and died, and the country lost so much because of mostly. I mean, Mussolini had his own colonial aspirations, but it was really Hitler that wanted to eradicate obviously the Jewish population, and was for him it was all about this notion of racial purity and all of the things that we know that go along with that. But so it puts it in better context as well. It actually said so in the diaries about how much Hitler had control over Mussolini and over Italy during the war and leading up to it. So it makes even more sense that somebody like Ciano, thought that was his way to break that power structure and say, like, okay, I'll get this stuff to the Allies because, like, this ship's going down with Hitler. What I mean?
He was just looking after himself and his family. That was it.
Right. Well, and also I want to throw in a couple details that are kind of key here that I found out along the way. And I think particularly the most interesting detail is that right after he fell out with Mussolini, Galeazzo initially got demoted from foreign minister to ambassador to the Vatican's Holy See organization.
Oh my God.
So essentially, right after betraying Mussolini, he was tasked with going to the Vatican and having a bunch of deep and private conversations about, honestly, God knows what, because he was executed shortly after. So
that's wild.
That to me is definitely one of the most interesting details, because
that was while James Angleton, right, how was he connected to the Vatican?
So James Angleton was actually a devout Catholic and also a member of the Knights of Malta. So that's how he was deeply connected to the Vatican.
I have a question about that, because I do want to see what you guys know about these knights. Are they related to the Knights Templar in any way? Are they the Knights Templar? Because I know in Portugal, they even, like, one of the towns in there became like a Templar town of sorts. And are they related in any way?
I think it's simplistic to really call them the same thing for sure.
I will say this. I had to rewatch the clip earlier. Malmgren did say that. So basically, and Geoff kind of helped us understand this too. My understanding of this, I'm still kind of, catching up. But Malmgren said that it looks like Malta might have been set up by the Vatican.
The relationship needs to be uncovered between Angleton's father, Angleton, and the Knights of Malta. The Knights of Malta had their long historical connection with the Vatican, and indeed have this special diplomatic status. It's a sovereign state. How did they get this sovereign state? The Vatican must have organized it.
They seem to have a lot of top-level business leaders and politicians involved in the Knights of Malta.
That's right. It's a secretive society. I mean, there are all these secret societies, but it's all connected with the Vatican.
But there are rumors that the Knights of Malta have something to do with the UFO story as well.
Well, what I'm saying is, yeah, they did because Angleton was there. He was a member.
Wow. So he's involved in the Vatican, which makes it more likely that James Jesus Angleton probably had something to do with the retrieval of that UFO, the Magenta crash, which was kept at the Vatican.
Yeah. I'm speculating now, but no doubt in my mind about my
You're speculating, but there's so many connections.
Because they both function the same in that they're established countries with no real land. And so they have as much power as any country. You know, I think Malta, somebody looked it up that we were talking to. There's only something like 800 passports like that exist right now out of Malta. And another thing is that turns out Bill Donovan and James Angleton of the CIA and OSS were Knights of Malta. Geoff told us basically that what that helped is that Angleton could sort of do whatever he wanted because he was protected by Malta's jurisdiction. So, and I don't exactly understand. This is all really new to me, but it is
just kind of throw something else out there. Apparently, the chief cardinal responsible for the rat lines was the leader of the Knights of Malta while the rat lines were happening.
Oh wow,
So,
that's right. Tell me that.
Like, yeah. So the effort to protect Nazis and kind of the organizations that Angleton were involved in are related, because that's essentially a lot of the activity that he got up to right at the end of the war. You know, he went around giving Nazis fake passports and saying, hightail it out of here, or we'll take you to America or something, like, you know. And if they didn't want to already go to America, which, you know, in some cases they didn't. Like in the case of Eugen Dolman, he stuck around in Rome and got arrested like 3 more times, where James Angleton would show up and bail him out every single time. Which is just, yeah. I mean, when you think about, you know, people can say whatever they want about that story, but just like the baseline logistics of it, like the chief of the CIA counterintelligence in the 50s stepping in personally to save an old Nazi source's, you know, well-being and keep them out of prison is like, to me, that's significant leverage that someone had over someone, even if it wasn't Eugen Dolman personally, which it might well have been. He might have had intimate knowledge about the Ciano diaries because he was the person who was in contact with Etta Ciano in the first place. So, you know, his involvement in the Sunrise negotiations obviously is not nothing either. So,
do you guys think today there might be some sort of still influence from that Paperclip group and whatever left, whatever Dulles left there? Because Harold also insinuated that Dulles may have been responsible for JFK's assassination, didn't he?
No, it was Dulles Angleton, yeah.
Yeah, well, and you know, and so, but just to kind of on broadly, I don't think that there's necessarily evidence to support that, but I think that, you know, if people kind of keep on trotting along in this direction, that's essentially what most people envision that they'll find, I think. And, you know, I think that as far as when it comes to the JFK stuff, if I can share my favorite fact about that is just Alan Dulles and his presence on the Warren Commission. That in itself, JFK fired Alan Dulles specifically because of the way that he ran the CIA. So the idea that he should then turn around and go be on a near head of the committee that is investigating the assassination is ludicrous. You know, that is just something that I think is a very underappreciated fact about the JFK assassination, and also speaks a lot to Alan Dulles' character as a person. Because, you know, was he a person with the capability to have the president killed? Most likely. Was he the person in the position to protect the people who killed the president? Absolutely. Did he do that? I don't know. We'll never know. Somebody shot Oswald.
Yeah.
Well, and also JFK created the DIA in '61. He wanted to sort of, decentralize the CIA and their power, because he knew full well they were doing stuff in secret. And he created the DIA as like a counterintelligence agency against the CIA, who would actually report to the president, because the CIA wasn't doing that. This stuff's all behind, yeah.
Well, and also there's the mechanisms in which all that money from Germany disappeared. It didn't really disappear. It went into Swiss bank accounts. Who then,
as it always happens.
and then Credit Suisse and a couple other prominent, Swedish banks, essentially ended up kind of consolidating all of this over time. And that's why you still see headlines to this day about Swiss banks and Nazi money.
Yeah.
So it's something that there is still literally cases in litigation about to this very day.
Mm.
And it's absolutely because, Germans felt like they needed to protect their ill-gotten gains. And often the only way that they were able to facilitate that was through a person like Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles secured pretty much all those strategic resources and more, possibly even more, from the Japanese. There was a man named Ken Hirata who came to the Vatican in 1943 on behalf of certain elements of the Japanese government before the bombing. That's always a super interesting story. So it's possible through that they had a whole different kind of realm of that was called magic intelligence. It's you might have heard that come up when people were talking about mystic intelligence before. Ken Hirata and his presence at the Vatican is kind of a central story in all that. And I'd encourage anyone who's not familiar to go look it up. It's a fascinating.
All right. Let me show you the other one here. What is this?
So this is the original. There are actually two, but I believe this was the first memos that were put out directly from Mussolini, and it's an order of secrecy related to this aircraft. So, I'll read it out loud because we have the translation handy. But yeah, personal order of the Duce. It is disposed immediate arrest, diffusion of news related to aircraft of unknown nature, an origin of which in dispatch of Stefani, date today, 7:30 a.m. Stop. Immediate recasting of any leads from the newspapers bearing said news is ordered. Stop. Maximum penalties for transgressors are foreseen to refer to the Supreme Court of State Security. Immediate confirmation of receipt, et cetera, et cetera.
What else did Richard Bissell tell you?
He said this didn't start last week. This has been going on. He mentioned that in 1933 Magenta.
He did?
Yes.
Richard Bissell mentioned the 1933 Magenta crash?
Yes.
That's amazing.
Exactly.
That is such corroboration, because that is a highly conflicted, account.
1933 was the first recovery in Europe, in Magenta, Italy.
I fully trust David Grush, but that's amazing that there's some corroboration from back then.
He mentioned it.
Wow.
Italian government moved it to a secure air base in Italy for the rest of kind of the fascist regime until 1944, 1945, and the Pope Pius XII back-channeled that.
So the Vatican was involved.
Yeah, and told the Americans what the Italians had, and we ended up scooping it.
So he said this. Yeah, he said this did not begin in you need to know the background. How did it end up that Truman transferred that object from Italy? The steps getting there was arranged by Allen Dulles. But that went back to what Pippa mentioned.
And he said the steps that Allen Dulles helped with the crash retrieval.
And remember, Allen Dulles, and so John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles are twins.
Yeah.
And John Foster Dulles is running the OSS, the precursor to U.S. intelligence. out of Switzerland.
According to multiple accounts, including UFO whistleblower David Grush, a disc-like object measuring roughly 10 to 12 meters in diameter came down near Magenta in Lombardy, Italy in June of 1933.
1933 was the first recovery in Europe.
Under Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, a total media blackout was imposed throughout the Stefani news agency. Telegrams threatened severe penalties for any reporters who deviated from a government-ordered cover story attributing the event to a meteor. Despite the censorship, a special investigative body known as Gabinetto, or RS-33, formed to study the craft, with high-level figures such as Mussolini, Air Marshal Italo Balbo, and Nobel laureate and radio pioneer Marconi, believed to have been involved. Testimonies suggest that the downed craft and possibly 2 recovered bodies were taken to the SIAI Marchetti private aerospace hangars for intensive analysis. This secret research group reportedly drew up a 9-step protocol to manage the Magenta crash and any similar future incidents. The instructions included immediate site containment, arrests of all witnesses, and thorough disinformation campaigns to quell public attention. Sounds very similar to what happened in the United States after Roswell.
So yeah, it kind of makes sense, even reading it now, that this was found in the morning, maybe it came down in the night, these farmers find it in a field. Word gets out, this is in Milan this is in Magenta, about 3 miles out from Milan, which just so happened to be where James Angleton was living with his family at the time. And
we also happen to specifically know that he was there in that summer because it was that fall that he went off to college for the first time, like a British kind of like prep college.
You know what's kind of weird though?
He would have been like 13 at the time.
You know what's kind of weird that they're talking to Harald Malmgren since he was like really young. I would imagine that the same thing happened with Dulles, that they kept tabs on him since he was like really young, right?
So actually, I'll actually tell you a really fascinating story about that because there's a really an example that has primacy when it comes to Alan Dulles in that kind of early training. Alan Dulles got an extra dose of that. It was actually very uncommon for him to be at home during his childhood. He spent most of his time in a Protestant monastery kind of deal, where he essentially spent 6 days in kind of what was like an extended Sunday school, and then the 7th day in church, with like essentially holidays where he's visiting home. So that's kind of like the backdrop of his kind of like everyday life and education to begin with. And then when he does go home on vacations, the audience can look up a man named Robert Lansing. And essentially, Robert Lansing would sit him and his brothers down and his other, the kids around and drill them on the proper way to think about geopolitics and also the way to have business acumen and also just how to be an economic terrorist in general, how to exploit people who are different than you because they don't understand anything about the contracts that you're making and so on and so forth. So Alan Dulles actually at the age of 8 years old became so opinionated about this that he wrote his first geopolitical letter of what he thought the country should do about Iran, and he gave it to his father to publish it. And his father loved this. And because he was such a multi-generational wealth kind of wasp, then he turned and made 700 copies of this 8-year-old's dissertation of what the country should do about Iran. And he shared it with all of his friends. And he goes, look, this is my son saying that American imperialism is okay. And he's only 8 years old. If he's an 8-year-old and he gets it, what are you too stupid not to get? And he literally went around Washington, D.C. doing that. So a lot of the people that Alan Dulles started out with his professional career in Wall Street and all these other places, essentially the first they had ever heard of Alan Dulles was a badly written and misspelled geopolitical essay with his father standing there insisting that it was like the gospel. So that's like the level of kind of fervor and the level of ideology that people expose their families to. And also that's the links that generational wealth would go to ensure that they would continue to have generational wealth. They would literally brainwash kids in no uncertain terms. They would make all their time and energy spent around thinking and acting in the way that they thought was acceptable for their family. And it was only until, when Alan Dulles went to Princeton and also to India that he started to think for himself a little bit and kind of do some other stuff. But still, he kind of did what his dad envisioned he would do anyway, because it was
he kind of became one of the biggest villains of this whole story.
And I'm sure he didn't see it like that. He probably thought that he was a hero.
No real villain does. I mean,
of course, but Alan Dulles probably especially. He probably just thought he was like, "Oh, you're just mad at me because I'm so charming," and he thought about everyone because he was just
read the room.
Well, he was an old boy like that. He was an old boy. I mean, he spent a lot of his time, especially even in the war, where it was just kind of drinking and whoring, and that's kind of that was just kind of the reality of how he spent a lot of his actual time in between meetings and stuff, is just kind of being a degenerate. So, obviously these are really complex issues, and I try to be clinical about them. I mean,
man, this like memo is really angry. Wild.
Yeah, and it was actually, Pale Oak was already who authenticated, I think, that one of the logos or something at top, or one of the stamps was an executive stamp, basically, like directly from the office. Yeah.
All right. I'm glad you added this though, because we got to talk about Christopher Sharp's and Geoff Cruickshank's work too, because they do excellent work.
I think working together, actually. Well, yeah, I mean, Geoff's been writing for Liberation Times, and I think,
I'm pretty sure Geoff has told me that he was one of the sources for that article.
I figured as much. Yeah. So one of the things, Geoff had found, and I think it might be the next slide there. One of the things Geoff had found was that he went through Donovan's. Oh, wait, there's that Cheston. That name came up earlier. Okay, weird.
Remember that. Wait, Charles S. Cheston? That's
I saw that earlier last night and related to Malmgren stuff. Okay. Anyway, one thing Geoff did, it's right here, is that he found this microfilm roll that was preserved by Donovan, and I think it was after he died, might have been the same year that Ciano's memoirs came out. I think it's 1977. They were returned back to some facility, and Geoff is the one who found this stuff, that this whole project that's been buried in time. And we've been finding more about this behind the scenes too, and we have more records and documents pertaining to it. But basically, there was a thing called the McGregor Project, and it had been in play for quite a while and involved all the big names, Bill Donovan, James Forrestal, Corso might have been involved. Like everybody we know later from the CIA and Roswell and all that, looks like they were all involved in this. And there will be more coming out about some of this stuff. This thing has been intentionally buried.
I was going to say we need to try our best to try to not spoil the McGregor stuff.
No, for sure. But I'll say,
I'll have you guys on again later. Don't worry about that.
Well, no, also, I just meant that, also another important reason why we kind of need to put it off is because we still need to process. I happened to be able to obtain a 300-page intelligence report about the McGregor Project. That was I found it somewhere on the internet, and was able to make copies before it disappeared forever. And I've released that to kind of the appropriate communities and stuff to kind of help begin processing it. But myself, I haven't processed it well enough to be able to make a whole lot of determinations. But
okay, so I'm just gonna play the last slide, which is this one. And there's a name there that has been talked about a bunch recently. So what can you tell me about this?
It's my suspicion, although I could be wrong because I've heard other stuff, that it was possibly the Magenta craft that Lockheed was looking to divest itself of, but was blocked.
The one that they talk about that they tried to move to Bigelow. Is that correct?
Right. Now, other people have said it's, a craft from the 50s, so it could have been that Kingman craft that was gifted. That's very, a very distinct possibility.
Well, if I'm correct, doesn't Richard Bissell have something to do with all this? And Richard Bissell kind of said something about the 1933 stuff. So, I mean, according to Malmgren, at least that is. So
yeah.
I'm
gonna play the clip though. I'm gonna play the clip.
Okay, because I think he basically just said that Bissell told him about Magenta.
Yeah,
and then it was pretty surreal to see him dig into the stuff that took us forever to put together about Brown Brothers Harriman. Alan Dulles was lead counsel there. Prescott Bush, George H.W. Bush's father, and Prescott's father-in-law, ran that firm. And so was Dulles and Averill Harriman, who were lead co-counsel. Dulles runs the OSS with Donovan and Angleton. After Roswell, they set up the CIA. Averill Harriman becomes Secretary of Commerce. He's in charge of setting up the Marshall Plan, in which Germany takes out loans. Basically, Europe takes out loans from the U.S.
Bush family, huh?
It's all the Bush family, yeah, pretty much.
Well, and going back a little earlier, it was Alan Dulles actually again at the Treaty of Versailles in 1917 that essentially created the conditions that allowed for the creation of the German war machine from 1933 forwards. And also, interestingly, it was Alan Dulles who went and signed a contract with Hitler that stated that Hitler would pay back, the loans that Germany had incurred in reparations from World War I. Back to America. And, obviously he signed the agreement, and that was kind of part of the agreement when Hitler was coming to power, whether or not the U.S. was going to be friendly to that or not. And since he signed that agreement with Alan Dulles, the U.S. was like, okay, I guess we can let Hitler be Chancellor of Germany or whatever. So, Alan Dulles is kind of everywhere. And it's honestly it's a crime that he isn't taught in every single school in this country to every single American, because he is, like it or not, he is one of the most pivotal and factually important Americans to ever live.
Yeah.
One of Stephen Greer's in that interview he did with Jesse a few weeks ago, he's asked, who's the deep state? And he says Alan Dulles. That's where it started. So he knows. I mean, he said the same thing, Bush family and Dulles, etc. So it just took a long time, listening to Danny Sheehan and stuff for me to kind of understand this. But eventually, that's the whole story is they get Magenta, they do all this shit in secret. They set up the CIA. They're basically just running their own operation the entire time,
Yeah. Well, and, the secrecy was baked like a cake right into the CIA. So, of course, it persisted. And, it seems like even the fight about it was designed to fail, and that's perhaps how it went private in the first place. Is that they essentially had created the conditions for it already to be ungovernable by a singular entity like that. And when it came to pass in the 70s or 80s or whenever they switched from legacy to whatever we got now, it's obvious that there was some kind of power struggle there, and the side of government-controlled research obviously lost. So
I went along putting all this stuff together back in September. I was just I feel like I'm fucking crazy walking around with all this stuff. And so I sat down thinking it would be one, cool, here's George Bush, Alan Dulles. And I ended up spending a week and a half, writing 8 pretty lengthy parts and posting them to a Medium account, going over all this, because it blew my mind, how this is all the same story, basically. And the connections are staring us in the face, but nobody's ever thought to really look at. And there are books that are written about Brown Brothers Harriman, the Bush family, Nazi influence. One of them is behind Danny Sheehan and the interviews he's been doing, or he was doing at least a few months ago. He made it a point of making sure that people noticed that. But we ended up just taking the long way around. And for me, it was kind of I think I started it the night that clip went, the night before. Danny Sheehan had done an hour-long interview where he only talked about George Bush. And then the next morning, that viral clip went around by Walter Kern saying that Grush told him that Cheney was at the top of things now. And so I was like, all right, I got to go. Let me just like figure this out. Why Bush and Cheney? You know,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
And Kissinger must be also part of that group, right?
Oh, they all were. Yeah.
Well, and, you know, and it's kind of doubly obvious about all that because, you know, Malmgren made the claim that, you know, Kissinger was essentially in kind of competition with the kind of whole side of the political equation that he happened to be on. And also, you know, something that stuck out to me is that he had a back channel with Putin that Kissinger wasn't aware of.
Yep.
Like, you know, so that, I mean, that just goes to show that, like, the annals of power and the deep geopolitics stuff that happens, that's a, you know, the extremely underappreciated and overcomplicated issue that, you know, it's not too often you get somebody like Mr. Malmgren who is even willing to speak about these kinds of things. So it's really amazing that he chose to spend some of his final moments on this earth doing that, essentially for this community. You know, on a podcast like Jesse Michels, I mean, he obviously knew kind of what he was giving his final endorsement to. So I was very inspired by that. You know, regardless of, you know, the nature of his testimony, whether it's true or whatever. I mean, it was a powerful testimony, and you really can't deny that, if anything else.
It does kind of feel like one of those before and after moments that is going to be talked about forever.
Yeah.
And especially with what happened today, that with the Wikipedia stuff,
right
after it's really wild.
Well, Chris
to those
Mellon,
who don't know, Chris Mellon's Wikipedia page was just deleted. I did a video before this one where I talk about it, but I didn't know it was deleted when I made the video, so it has now been deleted.
And Malmgren's has been nominated. Harald Malmgren was nominated. I think you said, Michael, did you say Pippa's was as well?
Pippa's too, yeah. Pippa's too. Yeah.
I mean, how fucking, you know what I mean? It's just like, this has been my joke the past year talking with you know, Michael and Geoff and them, is just like everything they're doing to sort of block and suppress this information just keeps backfiring every step of the fucking way, you know.
And it's funny because Geoff did mention that there were going to be debunks right after the interview. I guess this is what he meant.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. Guys, I want to ask you, what is coming next for you? If you want to make any announcements and where people can find
announcement you. Time, huh?
So, cool. Okay, so back, you know, I'm a filmmaker, not in any sort of big DOA. It's music videos, some shorts and stuff. And I think, I mean, some of this was out of kind of financial desperation, but, you know, back in August, I signed a lease for a place, and I was like, all right, we're going to make this story like our story, like our documentary. And I'd been watching interviews with Steve Bassett, and he was talking about the Hollywood Disclosure Alliance that he set up in 2023, which is, you know, an effort to put together people from the sort of UFO field and filmmakers. And so I reached out to him, and he got back to me and got me onto that. And then, you know, I started reaching out to producers, eventually got talking to, there's a pair and then another person that kind of is working with them. And they were excited at the gate. You know, I walked them through this whole story. It's gone through some other talks, you know, with them and other people. And then the final version is, it looks like they're going to direct and produce a movie or a documentary, maybe a trilogy of documentaries, but starting with Magenta, World War II, and all of this research that we just talked about, basically. And then us going over there to look into the specific idea of whether or not Italy and Germany went to World War II. And
so you guys are going to Italy?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
We do need funding. So
yeah,
we were talking about this before we started recording. So, you know, if this makes sense to anybody or anyone's interested in that part of it, you know, we can put you in touch with our producers. But yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's kind of overwhelming, but, you know, it's like we've been doing this work for nothing. for so long. You know, it's just like two dudes on Reddit, you know, and then just kind of working our way into, you know, these other conversations about all this stuff.
Yeah,
So,
and unfortunately, because we live under the materialistic paradigm, we wish we could do this for free if we didn't need to survive, you know. And this
yeah,
is something that I really struggle with people that complain about people trying to make a living out of this because
right.
they're dedicating their lives to it. And I
Right.
think that criticism is unwarranted, to be honest with you.
Right.
Not at all. No, I mean, it's, you know, it's like we're all being armchair historians putting together like the biggest mystery of the past century, you know, the biggest story that's, you know, been withheld from everybody. And like, sure, there are very, you know, blatant, obvious instances of, you know, people clickbaiting and shit like that. But like,
And lying, yeah.
lying, sure. But then there's, I mean, we all met again, you know, Michael and myself and Geoff, and, you know, it's like we all met just being really active on Reddit, just like trying to help each other put the story together because it mattered to us, you know. And you go beyond UFOs are cool to like, oh, we're talking about like governmental agencies and aerospace companies and like all this stuff happening behind the scenes and what Lou, you know, Elizondo and everybody else talking about, you know, follow the money. There's just like, that's where you really get into all this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that too is why I've always tried to focus on kind of having some evidentiary standards and also just kind of having a vision of like, you know, what it means to be confident in information when I talk about it, and like, you know, how to qualify things, because, you know, the reality is with a lot of this stuff is that we don't know for sure. It's illegal for me to know for sure. I don't have a classified security clearance. You know, if I did know some of these things for sure, they come along and arrest me.
Yeah,
so,
you probably get in real deep shit, bro.
Yeah, no, exactly. So and so that's definitely something that's been on my mind this whole time. And, you know, and also as somebody who, I've never done anything like this before in my life. You know, I'm definitely, like Craig said, an armchair historian, you know, and I'm doing my best. But codifying my research into something that has, you know, a hypothesis, a solid evidentiary framework, and, you know, something that is rigorous and professional is a primary concern of mine. You know, just because I'm a hobbyist doesn't mean I'm just messing around. Like,
yeah, of course.
And also, you know, kind of this documentary effort is partially me and Craig trying to go from hobbyist to this kind of being part of our career. Like, you know, I work at a smoke shop right now, and which is great.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great. Trust me, I really enjoy it. I love it, you know, but I don't want to be doing it for the rest of my life.
I run a one-man record label. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, great, you can do that for the rest of your life for sure. But, like, you know, you got room, obviously, for other things in your career. And, you know, I just want that too. So, like, is it okay if, like, you know, I don't starve to death trying to make a contribution to humanity? That's a question that I've asked myself over and over and over again while I'm starving myself to do this.
And you shouldn't, really.
You know, but, you know, and I do it anyway because I love it. And,
yeah,
you know, and I do it because I want to do it. And no one's ever going to stop me from doing it, even if no one ever gives me another dollar. You know, so it's just, if, you know, nobody ever gives me any money, then the research products are going to be very slow. It's going to be at great time and personal cost. And it's just not going to be feasible for it to be out at the pace that, you know, a consumer market wants it. So it's like, you know, it kind of leaves me with no option except to try to monetize the activity so that I can, you know, that I can effectively, you know, give it the resources, time, and energy, and also the team that it needs to succeed. I can't do these things by myself, you know. And
I think this is part of something that I think we should all be striving for, because something that I stumbled upon when I got into this, I'm a professional journalist, and I wasn't dealing with this stuff before I got into this. And I realized that there's a lack of professionalism in the field.
Yeah.
And I think that is starting to change. It's starting with the stigma receding and the military halls, and it has to go to media as well, which is still very much there. But I think that interviews like the one we saw yesterday with Harald and interviews like this one are going to contribute to that, and your documentary as well.
Well, and I'll say, I know we're trying to wrap up here. You know, it's something I keep, you know, bringing up to people is like, Lou Elizondo and Carl Nell both said that, this is a grassroots effort, and not, I mean, even by whatever it is, non-human intelligence that we're dealing with, like it's going to reveal itself in a grassroots manner, and then also for me, what I've been watching since Grush came forward, especially, is like across the board, even outside of this topic in society, we're at a point where we're really pushing for, a decentralization of power. So even right now, as like legacy media is sort of collapsing, and social media and YouTube channels, things like podcasts are taking over, and then the people just get to decide where they follow, and who it is they trust, as opposed to like, oh, I only have like 4 options on TV and that's kind of it. And they're going to choose what they want to tell us, like now you go here, you go on TikTok, and you have people every day breaking down scandals and weird shit, UFO shit, whatever. It's just like, they're like, let's talk about this Banking Act of 1919 and why it affects now, whatever, it's just like, you can learn a lot faster, and so this is, I think it genuinely is part of a revolution, I agree. And it's all about information, above everything.
And it's also like a natural consequence of the media not telling it like it is, not telling the truth.
Yeah,
it is gonna go over different places and just spill like it's happening right now.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's an important point too, because I mean, as a civilian, to be this deeply involved in the intrigue that has such geopolitical consequence, it's nerve-wracking. I don't want to create like an international incident. I don't want to be dealing with intelligence agencies all across the world necessarily, but like I do want a better future for humanity. And I want us to deal with these really difficult issues. So, it's kind of one of those things where I've kind of just had to have faith over fear that I'm doing the right thing, and that, all these super complicated decisions that I'm making are, I'm trying my best, So, I'm super grateful for this platform. Super grateful for your time.
Yeah, grateful to have you guys. You guys are awesome, and thank you for all the research that you've spent, all the time you spent doing this research, and all those hours. And I'm sure that you guys were like having a full circle moment yesterday when you were seeing Harold.
Oh yeah, it was totally surreal. Yeah, it was. We were both like, we called each other and we like couldn't talk.
We just kind of looked at each other like,
it's happening.
That's beautiful to see, man.
We were watching the interview as when the filmmakers got a hold of us, and they didn't even know about the interview with Malmgren. They were just, we got the green light. Think about funding. And I'm like, I can't make any decisions.
Oh my God.
I know. And it was funny. It was actually within 2 minutes that you texted us and you were like, how do we introduce you? Or how do I introduce you? And I was like,
I can't think right now.
Pause. Like, it was definitely one of those moments like, okay, I guess you're wondering how I got here. Like, like record scratches and like the movie pauses, like,
That's so cool to see, man. I like that. So where can people find you before we leave? If anybody wants to get a hold of you guys or reach out, where can they find you, Craig?
I've got a Medium account I've been trying to keep up with, because I think a lot gets lost in the shuffle. It's called Escape Velocity. And so I wrote a series about the Bush Dulles stuff, and now, a lot of the stuff that like Geoff Cruickshank is doing, and trying to at least collect a lot of that. I've got, I set up a YouTube and a TikTok and a Twitter. I'll call the Magenta Project.
Yeah.
Cool.
Those are pretty easy to find.
And Craig primarily runs those. I'm kind of often off in the weeds. Oh.
Okay.
Did
it turn off? Oh yeah, it turned off.
They just don't stop. See you later, dude.
Okay. We'll wrap it up. I guess that's time. Thank you so much, Craig, and tell Michael to keep it up, and I'll have you guys on soon again. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, appreciate this.
All right. And give me the links to everything. I'll post everything in the description. All right.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll send it over super soon.
Thank you guys. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Michael, who's no longer here, but I'll see you guys later.
Yeah.
You know what to do, guys. Like and subscribe. Take care.
Stay inquisitive.
Stay inquisitive. Yeah.